At 8 p.m. Coordinated Earth time, the Hushline Array saw the war coming. The first alert was not dramatic. No sirens screamed across the planet. No enormous shadow rolled over continents. It began as a deviation in deep space light, a thinning and thickening of faint stars beyond Neptune, followed by a pattern of heat blooms so regular that only engines could have made them. The array had been built for patience. Human astronomers and military planners had learned long ago that space rarely rewarded panic. It rewarded careful watching, accurate clocks, and the kind of attention that could tell the difference between a comet shedding dust and a fleet bleeding velocity. The fleet belonged to the Kharit Dominion. Their ships came in layered wedges and armored spines, dark as forged iron against the spread of the solar system. They did not drift like traders. They arrived in disciplined deceleration burns, each vessel bleeding speed in measured intervals so that no formation tangled with another. That alone told Earth what kind of enemy this was. Sloppy forces died in deep space. Fleets that reached a target in perfect shape had been doing it for a long time. By 9 p.m. their ultimatum had crossed the distance between the outer system and the inner relay stations. Earth was given 24 hours to submit its orbital industry, planetary governments, and interplanetary traffic to Kharit administration. Resistance, the message said, would be answered with exemplary force. All military assets were to power down. All shipyards were to surrender docking authority. All off-world colonies were to acknowledge Dominion taxation and tribute schedules. The tone was not enraged, it was bored. That was how the Kharit preferred it. The Dominion had expanded across the Delacourt reach, by teaching whole regions of settled space that conquest was not a crisis. It was a process. Their fleets did not rage. They processed, arrive, demand, intimidate, accept surrender, install overseers, redirect shipping, move on. Against enough worlds, that had worked. From the command decks of the incoming armada, Earth looked vulnerable. It was populous, rich, inventive, and annoyingly independent, but not obviously prepared for total war. Humanity maintained defense squadrons, station guns, and a respectable patrol presence throughout its local space, yet the Kharit had crushed heavier concentrations before. They had broken worlds with more ships and less imagination. Brumek Taal, field commander of the invasion force, understood fear very well. He had built his reputation on it. He knew what happened in enemy capitals after an ultimatum landed. Generals argued over impossible deployment schedules. Politicians talked bravely in public and shook in private. Civilian traffic jammed orbital lanes. Insurance networks failed. Food markets panicked. Every weakness hidden by prosperity rose into view at once. He expected all of that from Earth. What he received, at 10:12 p.m., was a formal acknowledgment from Caldris Ring, signed by Senior Revenue Assessor Moira Delacourt. The message was courteous. It thanked the Dominion for declaring its political and fiscal intentions before entering treaty-regulated inner lanes. It then informed the fleet that any power asserting sovereignty over occupied systems or claiming tribute from recognized populations must provide supporting documentation under the Selendi Accords. Attached was a list: proof of territorial transfer, cargo manifests, reactor isotope declarations, crew quarantine logs, casualty bonds, debt assumption notices, ownership chains for seized infrastructure, legal basis for tribute assessments imposed in the Delacourt reach, environmental compliance reports for the handling of biological goods, certification of responsibility for civilian support networks in annexed systems. At the bottom, in language dry enough to make steel sound emotional, Delacourt added that failure to submit the relevant records could expose the Dominion to penalties, port denial, and material seizure across treaty space. Brumek stared at the translated text in contemptuous silence. Some of his officers laughed. One did not. Auditor Vask, the Kharit prefect assigned to legal compliance and occupation transfer, felt the small cold change in his chest that came whenever a battle had already begun, and the loudest people in the room had failed to notice. He knew records. He knew how the Dominion made them, reshaped them, concealed them, or simply ignored them when convenient. He also knew what Earth was famous for beyond its shipyards and research labs. Humans measured everything. They had earned that habit the hard way. Long before they crossed between stars, they had learned to survive in machines that could not forgive carelessness. Air had to be cleaned. Water had to be recycled. Muscles faded in low gravity. Bones lost density. Radiation crept through shielding and into blood. Heat could not be wished away in vacuum. It had to be moved, spread, and rejected carefully. On a planet, life hid waste and error in wind, oceans, forests, and distance. In space, waste circled back into your mouth, your lungs, your coolant pipes, your crops. Humans built cultures around that reality. Some species became excellent conquerors because they had predators in their ancient past. Some became philosophers because their skies had been calm, and their ecologies forgiving. Humanity had been shaped by scarcity, argument, accident, and engineering diagrams. Even before their first stations left low orbit, they had become people who tracked kilograms, parts per million, and margins. They knew what a missing seal meant. They knew what a mislabeled valve could cost. They knew that if the accounting was wrong, eventually the oxygen was wrong too. That instinct had followed them into interstellar civilization. Their contracts were precise. Their docking systems were dependable. Their quarantine rules were irritating and effective. Their freight ledgers became trusted because ships kept arriving alive when humans had certified them. Their legal codes spread not because they were elegant, but because insurers, traders, and colonists discovered that human paperwork reduced the chance of dying from someone else's negligence. The Dominion had not invaded a planet. It had tripped over a civilization built on audited survival. On Earth, Omar Ibarra read Delacourt's transmission with a stillness that his aides found both reassuring and unnerving. He did not smile. Smiling would have suggested the gesture was merely clever. It was not. He had approved the response because he understood exactly what it meant. Ibarra was not a battlefield commander. He was the senior coordinator of interplanetary policy, a position that required him to manage politicians, industrial consortia, off-world governors, and military budgets without letting any of them believe he enjoyed it. He had spent half his adult life explaining to impatient people that civilization in space depended less on heroics than on standards. Ships flew because inspections were enforced. Habitats endured because maintenance schedules were not treated as suggestions. Trade lasted because somebody had to care which crate of seed stock belonged to whom. Now an empire had arrived assuming those habits made humanity soft. "Nikhil," Ibarra said across the secure line, "they're going to push inward the moment they understand what this means." Fleet Marshal Nikhil Arden stood aboard the command station embedded in lunar orbit, watching tactical projections assemble themselves into hard choices. He had the posture of a man who never wasted motion because motion in his profession always had a cost. "They understand already," he said. "Brumek may pretend he doesn't. Can you hold them?" Arden glanced at the map, but he was not really looking at the symbols. He was calculating time, fuel, thermal load, docking turnarounds, and how many mistakes the enemy would need to make before Earth could turn one into a catastrophe. "I can make them pay for moving," he said. "That's enough for now." Ibarra gave the order activating Palomar Protocol at 10:30 p.m. From a distance, it looked unimpressive. No glorious fleet charge surged toward the outer system. No giant cannon swung around the planet like a threat from legend. Instead, tugboats went to work. Ore haulers altered lanes. Tankers lifted from quiet depots and shifted to pre-planned holding orbits. Civilian traffic that had drilled for emergency dispersal since childhood education courses began following calm routing notices. Custom satellites changed posture. Freight stations opened sealed vaults containing machine parts, portable radiators, emergency habitat skins, and ammunition cores stored under commercial inventory law. That was the first Kharit mistake. They mistook orderly movement for weakness. Disorder looked emotional, and Brumek trusted emotions because he knew how to use them. He did not trust order because he did not understand what disciplined civilian infrastructure could become under pressure. Humanity had never really divided space into tidy categories of peace and war. It could not afford to. Every station, freighter, and maintenance yard in the solar system had been built by people who knew that in vacuum, survival systems were strategic systems. A tug that could move a refinery module could move armor. A freight launcher that could send ore with high precision could throw dense slugs into a hostile lane. A warehouse storing water for habitat reserves held both life and mass in orbit was never just weight. It was shielding, momentum, protection, and leverage. By midnight, Caldris Ring had become more than a station. It had become a legal fortress. Every treaty relay that mattered was receiving copies of the Dominion's ultimatum along with Delacourt's request for supporting records. Every banking network that financed interstellar shipping was being quietly informed that a major military actor had made territorial claims without supplying proof of lawful transfer. Every insurer, debt registrar, and neutral port authority was being reminded of their exposure if they serviced uncertified conquest fleets. Meanwhile, on another level of the ring, Dr. Sanaa Kelm was building a war from traces too small for ordinary eyes. Kelm had trained in microbial ecology and closed-loop habitat resilience before moving into forensic systems analysis. She was exactly the sort of specialist most empires forgot to fear. Spacecraft were ecosystems wrapped in metal. They carried more than crews and weapons. They carried bacteria in waterlines, fungi in air ducts, trace residues from processed food, lubricants from certain factories, isotopic signatures from refined fuel, and tiny chemical habits that no commander ever noticed until an expert explained why they mattered. Commander Joel Otieno worked beside her, organizing military intelligence, customs archives, and engineering feeds into a common model. He had learned logistics the old human way, by starting with impossible supply problems and shaving off each illusion until only the real problem remained. He did not romanticize fleets. Ships were hungry things. They needed propellant, spare parts, coolant, reactor service windows, and clean biology. Even victorious ships decayed. "Tell me what they've touched," he said. Kelm was already there. The invasion fleet's earlier campaigns across the Delacourt Reach had left signatures in every transfer orbit and service stop. Captured refinery tags showed up in exhaust chemistry. Certain rare isotope ratios indicated fuel cracked in Minrathi industrial chains, not in Kharit territory. Grain transport seals from occupied systems carried fungal markers associated with blight outbreaks the Dominion had blamed on local mismanagement. Reactor casings in surveillance images bore microscopic wear patterns consistent with leased Solvane League cores. Somewhere, at some port, paperwork had lied. And human systems loved lies for one reason. Lies made patterns. By 1 a.m., Olir Vask had reached the same conclusion from the other side. He sat in Brumek's flagship listening to officers dismiss Earth's response as theatrical stalling. One wanted to answer the document request with weapons fire. Another proposed broadcasting images from prior conquests. A third insisted the humans were trapped in legal formalities because they lacked courage. Vask said nothing for a long time. His loyalty to the Dominion had never been simple devotion. He believed in order, in hierarchy, in the prevention of chaos between worlds large enough to tear themselves apart. The Dominion had offered that, or so it claimed. It had also offered prestige to efficient men. Vask had risen because he could impose clean structure on messy annexations. But he had seen enough of the Delacourt Reach to know that the annexations were less clean than the report said. Tribute schedules were padded. Casualty accounts were shifted onto the conquered. Seized property was relabeled without proper chain of title. Occupation governors took shortcuts because fear covered them. Fear had always covered them. Until now. "Commander," Vask said at last, "we should prepare full declarations." Brumek turned toward him slowly. "You are advising compliance?" "I am advising containment," Vask said. "If we refuse, they will distribute that refusal. They may distribute whatever they wish. They are cornered." Vask almost answered that Earth did not look cornered. It looked busy. But Brumek was one of those men who heard caution as insult. So Vask chose another truth. "We do not have complete records for every annexed asset." Brumek's eyes hardened. "Then build them." There it was, the old Dominion instinct. If the record was weak, create one. If the transfer had been unlawful, relabel it. If the cargo was contaminated, alter the filing date. If tribute was extortion, call it stabilization duty. That method had worked because no one had ever had the leverage to force an audit under threat of collective port sanctions. No one except humanity. At 2:30 a.m., the first notices hit neutral trade space. The Solvane League suspended service guarantees for any carrier directly attached to the Kharit invasion group pending verification of asset origin. Minrathi industrial syndics submitted emergency claims over refineries listed as war spoil. 2 independent convoy insurers invoked contamination clauses on grain and biosupport shipments tied to Dominion campaigns. 1 treaty port in the outer lanes issued a cautious advisory that uncertified Kharit vessels might be denied reactor cooldown service. These were not acts of war. They were, in some ways, worse. No fleet could stay dangerous forever on courage alone. A warship burned reaction mass every time it changed course. In deep space, maneuvering capacity was wealth made physical. Humans called it Delta V, the total freedom of motion a ship carried in its tanks. spend too much of it approaching a target, or dodging obstacles, or correcting avoidable errors, and the ship became a predator with failing legs. The Dominion fleet had come to force surrender quickly. Every hour of delay converted strategic advantage into an accounting problem. How much coolant remained within safe cycling range? How many radiator panels could operate continuously before maintenance? How much food margin existed if dock access was denied? How many escorts had already dipped into reserves during deceleration? Earth was not trying to win a glorious battle. Earth was reducing the enemy to arithmetic. Brumek finally understood this around 4 a.m., and understanding enraged him. He ordered the fleet inward. Arden had expected that. The Marshal's defense did not rely on dramatic annihilation. He knew the Kharit ships were dangerous, heavily armed, and built for direct intimidation, so he shaped the space they had to cross. Bulk freighters repositioned into legal emergency corridors that the Dominion could not simply vaporize without creating debris hazards for themselves. Mining tugs nudged ballast hulks into carefully calculated lines where the enemy would either waste fuel dodging or lose formation coherence. Reflective sail arrays, originally intended for power management and light pressure experiments, were redeployed in clustered veils to distort targeting returns at inconvenient moments. Civilian stations vented no panic. They vented data, schedules, masses, and clearances into a defense network that treated every object in orbit as part of a larger equation. This was another human lesson written into action. On a planet, armies marched across ground they could see. In space, movement was geometry and timing. You did not merely decide to go somewhere. You entered a path that had consequences. Speed cost fuel. Course changes cost fuel. Safe approach windows were narrow. Heat built up when systems worked hard, and heat in vacuum had to be radiated away with patience no commander could bully. At 6:15 a.m., the first Kharit destroyer wing tried to cut a fast line around a cluster of freight hulks near lunar transfer space. Arden let them commit. Then Caldris Ring's freight launchers, devices built to fling processed metal toward construction zones without wasting chemical propellant, fired dense tungsten slugs across the predicted exit corridor. The weapons were not elegant. They were not meant to be. In vacuum, elegance often lost to momentum. One Kharit destroyer sheared armor and vented half a deck to space. Another twisted hard, overcompensated, and spent more maneuver reserve in 20 seconds than its captain had planned for an hour. The rest pulled back into a safer plane. No human officer cheered. The point was not destruction. The point was expense. By 8 a.m., Kelm and Otieno had enough to begin breaking the Dominion's outer shell. Their compiled report showed that several Kharit support ships carried reactor fuel refined at Menrathi plants whose transfer records had never been lawfully updated. Multiple agricultural transports bore contamination traces consistent with known crop diseases from occupied stations. Tribute ledgers from captured worlds matched no recognized debt structures and contained mathematically impossible loss allocations, meaning the Dominion had billed conquered populations for damage inflicted during their own invasion actions. On one seized fabrication platform, serial markers visible in maintenance images corresponded to Solvane League lease registries that remained active. That one detail made Solvane financiers furious. Empires feared gunfire. Markets feared precedent. By 9:40 a.m., the Kharit fleet was no longer approaching a frightened system. It was approaching a spreading legal contagion. Neutral actors who had tolerated Dominion expansion as regrettable but profitable began pulling away. A ship denied standard service schedules was a ship whose future combat value declined hour by hour. A fleet under asset dispute was a fleet whose commanders could one day be held personally liable under treaty courts. Officers who had once trusted collective victory to shield them started studying one another with private suspicion. No alien trick did this to them. Human filing standards did. Older Vask watched the tremor move through command channels and made the hardest decision of his life. He had always told himself that the Dominion's flaws were practical imperfections, not structural corruption. Every state lied a little. Every occupation took shortcuts. Order still had to be maintained. Better disciplined rule than regional chaos. Better hierarchy than endless piracy. Better hard peace than romantic freedom collapsing into famine. But the evidence crossing his terminal was not small corruption. It was fraud, stacked on coercion, made survivable only by speed. The Dominion did not govern properly, and then occasionally lie. It conquered fast enough that truth never had time to catch up. Earth had given truth time. At 11:05 a.m., Vask copied protected records from the flagship's annexation archive to an isolated buffer and transmitted a discreet signal through channels he knew human interceptors would be watching. He did not announce defection. He did not grandstand. He simply released enough authentication keys to prove that Earth's suspicions were correct and that the deeper files existed where Kelm and Otieno suspected. When the handoff was detected, Joel Otieno looked at the source trail, then at Kelm. "He knows we've got them," Otieno said. Kelm shook her head. "He knows they've got themselves." The revelation changed everything. By noon, Caldris Ring had the complete shape of the case. Moira Delacourt did not behave like a woman holding the fate of an invasion in her hands. She reviewed exhibits, corrected formatting, rejected one section for insufficient source notation, and requested that 2 contamination charts be simplified for non-technical review. Her staff moved around her in controlled urgency. Outside, armed escorts guarded data cores and relay suites. Inside, Delacourt worried about whether a tribunal packet sent in haste might later be challenged on procedural grounds. This, too, was profoundly human. Not because humans lacked passion, but because their most dangerous passion often expressed itself as refusal to do a crucial thing sloppily. At 1 p.m., she began the live submission under the Selendi Accords. The interstellar relay carried her voice to neutral ports, creditor houses, station councils, and enough governments to ensure that even those who claimed disinterest would hear summaries within the hour. She laid out the case point by point. Unsupported sovereignty claims, fraudulent tribute schedules, illicit debt transfers, unlawful possession of bonded industrial hardware, biosafety violations connected to supply chain negligence in occupied systems, incomplete casualty records, false asset origin statements. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Each finding came with corroboration: isotope analysis, lease registries, contamination mapping, archived contract chains, Vask's authentication markers. Human law did not win by sounding righteous. It won by leaving no gap wide enough for a liar to escape through. Brumek Taal listened from the flagship and understood, too late, that this hearing was more dangerous than any missile barrage. If the ruling held, every treaty port across a broad section of settled space could deny his force service. Every conquered world might challenge Dominion levies. Every ambitious subordinate might decide that loyalty to a sinking fraud was poor career planning. He chose violence because violence was the only language left to him. At 1:22 p.m., he ordered a direct strike on Caldris Ring. The attack came fast. Kharit cruisers surged into aggressive burn, shedding cautious formation in favor of speed. Their targeting focused on relay clusters, data vaults, and the Ring's external freight launchers. It was not a clean military objective. It was an attempt to destroy the records before the ruling crystallized into shared fact. Arden had expected that too. Human defense ships rose from masked holding positions in staggered vectors. Station guns fired not in one glorious broadside, but in carefully timed sequences designed to force Brumek's lead elements into repeated corrections. Civilian water reserves, transferred during the night under Palomar Protocol, were vented in massive glittering sheets around vulnerable ring sectors. In atmosphere, water was life. In vacuum, in the right place and moment, it was also shielding mass against beam bloom and fragment spread. Some Kharit captains were shocked by the sight. They had expected humans to protect water at all costs. They did not understand that the humans were protecting it by using it. On a station, stored water was never only for drinking. It was radiation shielding, thermal ballast, emergency reserve, and sometimes armor if the situation turned desperate enough. Brumek's flag cruiser pushed forward regardless, radiator arrays glowing hard with accumulated heat, maneuver jets firing in wasteful bursts as the ship bullied its way through the cluttered orbital geometry. He wanted Caldris Ring broken in front of every watching world. What he found instead was a battlefield made by people who had spent centuries learning how not to die in machines. The freight launchers fired. Dense slugs crossed the engagement space at velocities that made explanation meaningless to anyone standing in their path. Arden had no interest in dramatic center mass kills. He targeted thrust structures, maneuver surfaces, and external cooling assemblies. A ship destroyed outright could still become a martyr in the stories of loyal officers. A ship crippled by the exact failure points every engineer feared became something else. Proof that someone understood it better than its commander did. Brumek's cruiser took the first hit along a lateral thruster bank. The second smashed a radiator wing into twisted metal. The third forced an emergency roll that bled fuel and broke alignment for the weapons meant to cut into Caldris Ring's relay spine. Around it, human defense craft darted in disciplined arcs, never lingering, never indulging in duels of pride. Their pilots knew the old truth. In space, glory had terrible mass ratios. Moira Delacourt continued the hearing while the station shook. A relay panel burst in one chamber. Security crews sealed a hull scar 3 corridors away. Somewhere below, a civilian maintenance worker cried once in fear and then returned to tightening emergency clamps because people were still alive on the other side of that bulkhead. Delacourt finished her submission. At 1:41 p.m., the Selendi Review Board issued emergency recognition of probable cause for collective interdiction, asset impoundment, and treaty port denial pending full adjudication. In simpler terms, the Kharit invasion fleet had just been turned into a traveling liability. Word spread faster than fire. One neutral port cut service immediately. Another announced conditional quarantine on all Kharit vessels. Menrathi syndics filed recovery enforcement. Solvane finance houses suspended every guarantee connected to Dominion annexation cargo. Merchant convoys on the edge of the conflict altered routes without waiting for official guidance. Across the Velcor Reach, occupied administrators began discovering that local elites who had obeyed from fear were now asking to see the numbers behind old tribute demands. Fear was leaving the room. Brumek felt it first in his own command net. Responses slowed. 2 support captains requested clarification on resupply doctrine. An escort leader asked whether personal liability protections remained in force. One rear logistics officer cut transmission mid-sentence, then came back with a flatter tone, already sounding like a man planning his defense before a tribunal. The field commander looked at the battle, the drifting shards of his damaged approach, the human ships refusing to overextend, and the unforgivable certainty that he had lost something larger than initiative. He had lost inevitability. Olar Vask sent one final message, openly this time, to every Kharit senior officer who still had a functioning receiver. Preserve records. Cease destruction of evidence. Request custodial negotiation under treaty law. Further escalation will not restore legal standing. Brumek called him traitor. Perhaps he was. Or perhaps he had become something the Dominion had forgotten how to value. A servant of reality. The firing tapered by 2:10 p.m. Not because the Kharit had been annihilated. They had not. They still had guns, armor, and enough power to make any foolish pursuit costly. But their approach vectors were compromised. Their fuel margins were worse than planned. Their access to support was collapsing, and every additional shot now deepened the record against them. Arden did not chase. He tightened control lanes, extended denial fields, and let the enemy feel the full weight of motion without freedom. That was the final human lesson of the day. The strongest species in the room was not the one that shouted loudest, struck first, or looked most terrifying against the stars. It was the one that had built a civilization able to turn law into logistics, logistics into strategy, and strategy into restraint. Humanity had not won because it was crueler than the Dominion. It had won because it understood systems deeply enough to make cruelty inefficient. Omar Ibarra addressed the Interplanetary Council that evening at 7 p.m. He was tired, but his voice carried the steadiness of a man who understood that victory becomes dangerous when celebrated carelessly. He did not announce a new empire. He did not call for revenge. He called for inspections, arbitration, debt review, liberation mechanisms for occupied populations, and emergency agricultural support for worlds whose supply chains had been poisoned by Dominion shortcuts. If humanity had proved anything, he said, it was that civilization in space depended on trust made measurable. That trust had to be rebuilt where conquest had corroded it. Across the watching networks, many listeners expected a triumphal speech about warships. Instead, they heard about reactor maintenance windows, crop disease tracing, shipping insurance, quarantine integrity, and why a lie about ownership in one star system could become a famine 3 systems away. The strange part was that it inspired people more than fury would have, because they finally understood what Earth had defended. Not just territory. A way of living among the stars where details mattered because lives did. Brumek Taal was taken into custodial confinement weeks later after his own subordinates refused an order that would have turned their retreat into piracy. Vask entered protected testimony, and his evidence reached far beyond one fleet. Kharit tribute ledgers across the Delacourt Reach began to unravel under scrutiny. Worlds long bent under occupation started reopening records no one had dared question. Moira Delacourt returned to work with less ceremony than many thought she deserved. There were still appeals to process, contaminated shipment reviews, and emergency claims from liberated stations. She handled them all with the same expression she had worn when an invasion fleet appeared over Earth and expected surrender. By then, the wider galaxy had learned the story. They had assumed humans would become frightening only when they opened fire. It was more unsettling to discover that humans became truly unstoppable when they opened a file, checked the numbers, and asked one quiet question no empire could answer. Can you prove any of this belongs to you?